Given the global drive toward decarbonization, why are the building blocks of this transition in short supply? Well, the answers are as complex as the mining industry itself, and today our guest will help us understand this. Ernest Scheyder is the author of The War Below: Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. Ernest unfolds the layers of choice we face as a global community, striving for sustainability while grappling with the realities of extracting the resources that power this transition. Stay tuned. Ernest will join us in a moment for this episode of Inside ESG. Inside ESG is a timely new production which takes you inside the work of practitioners on the ground, chief risk officers, market analysts, cybersecurity experts, and founders of game-changing startups. We'll talk with specialists in every corner of the globe, across industries and issues, dropping into Argentina to hear about lithium mining, Central Asia for a view of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and West Africa for a perspective on climate risk, among other stops. Hi, Ernest. Thanks for joining the show today.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Maureen.
I have to say that your book was kind of a revelation for me because those of us that work in the mining industry or have for some time, we're used to reading things from the point of view of people in the industry. So it's, assuming that all of the myriad steps required in launching a mining operation or even getting a project finance are well known. And what I really liked about your book is you kind of brought, I think, non-mining readers in with a sense of wonder at the complexities. So, and it also seems to me like you've been somewhat bitten by the mining bug. You're clearly finding it very interesting. And so I just wondered, before you were on that beat as a reporter, did you suspect that it would be so captivating?
The book really builds off of my work at Reuters, where I've been a journalist for almost 15 years. And before I wrote about the mining industry, I was writing about oil and gas for about 7 or 8 years, and spent some time living actually in North Dakota writing about the Bakken shale boom, so physically immersed really in the oil and gas space. And the reason that I transitioned to covering the critical minerals space a few years ago is because I became very curious about this energy transition. At the time, Teslas were still very, very new or nascent, even more niche than they are today. The idea of everyone getting an electric car was so far out in the future. But we did see a lot of devices, cell phones, laptops, etc., continuing to permeate everyday lives, and they're all built with critical minerals. So I became curious about, okay, well, where are the building blocks for these devices going to come from? And in that regard, it's a much more complex space than just oil or gas, which tends to be a very well-established production process. So how you extract lithium is so different than how you extract nickel, and copper is obviously very different as well. And so those are just three metals right there. And so having the complexities and really diving into or drilling down, if you forgive the pun, was sort of an intriguing challenge for me. And that's why in my day job I dove into that. And the book really unpacks the challenges that we face as a world, really, if we want this energy transition. But that's going to require gargantuan amounts of metals to be produced. And the book really is an exploration of choice. What are the choices that we're willing to face if we want this energy transition? And I really wanted readers to have to grapple with that, because I don't think we've had to do that really collectively, especially in the West, for some time.
Indeed. No, we haven't. And I love that you described it as being about choice. I think choice is something, as you allude to in your book, that candidates running for elected office would rather kind of not make the choice quite so clear.
Indeed.
To the base they're pursuing. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things that I drill down to into the book, is that sometimes parts of, especially the U.S. government, don't know what the other parts are doing. And so while there might be an attempt to move a mining project forward by one department or financially support it, another part of the U.S. federal government might take steps that could block that project or hurt that project. And so those things being at odds seem to run counter to the efforts or the stated goals of leaders, whether that's in the White House or in Congress or elsewhere, to move towards climate change abatement. And so really sort of getting into the nitty gritty and teasing that out was one of my main goals of the book. And the book is not a policy book, though. It's not written for geologists or investors. It's written for everyday people. And I was at pains to really show the complexities of these issues through the lens of the actors that are on the front lines. I wanted people to actually see like who has skin in the game, why they have taken the positions they've taken, what makes them tick, in order to help the reader determine for her or himself how they would come down on these issues, because these are really complex, sticky areas. Should we dig up indigenous holy sites to get copper? Should we potentially risk the pollution of large waterways in order to get nickel? Does a rare flower matter more than lithium? And these are all real world examples that are happening and that we explore in the book. And there's no easy sort of right or wrong answer, but we've been putting our heads in the sand too long, I'm convinced, as Americans, as citizens of the West, and not thinking these things through. And, Maureen, it was only, 4 years ago this month that the world really began to grapple with the idea that many countries in the West don't produce masks. Certainly the United States at the time did not produce masks. And that was just sort of one basic yet crucial piece of medical equipment that we all used throughout the pandemic. Now you just sort of extrapolate that to all these other electronic gadgets and gizmos and how they're built, and you realize that the United States and many Western countries don't produce large amounts of lithium or nickel or cobalt or other critical minerals. And you look at the demand projections out to 2035 and you sort of scratch your head and say, okay, well, where are these things going to come from? And if we aren't comfortable producing them within our own borders, are we comfortable at them being produced at places that might not have ESG standards that we would consider acceptable? Are we comfortable with other countries using their production of these critical minerals as economic weapons? What are the standards by which we would allow mining in our own borders? And where would we allow it and where would we not allow it? So these are part of the complex things that I really hope folks think through as they read The War Below.
Yeah, I think you've succeeded in capturing, the person on the street's view, and
Mm-hmm.
that's one reason it was so refreshing to read. It wasn't your typical anti-mining manifesto, nor was it an industry piece. One reason I think for sure that a lot of investors would just stay away from commodities investments is their volatility. I liked another aspect of volatility. There's price volatility, of course, and then there's movements of interest rates and other macro drivers. But there seems to be there's a lot of volatility in opinion, and that can
Mm-hmm.
also affect big projects. And you mentioned at least one case where the very same group was pro mining in the second case that you brought up, whereas before they had stated they were not just against a project, but against the industry.
Well, I mean, yet therein lies part of the complexity here and part of the stickiness that I hope the reader sort of wades into. You're right. I mean, we often have examples, and the book has multiple examples of the confusing regulatory climate that some mining industry face. And I would also argue that some conservationists and others face. If the rules are unclear on both sides, then it's sort of unclear how people can sort of move forward depending on their perspectives on mining projects. Maureen, a great example is the law that governs hard rock mining in much of the United States West has been on the books since 1872. That was when Ulysses S. Grant was president. That was before anybody thought of certainly electric vehicles, certainly laptops, computers, etc. And it was a law written for a very different time. Now it's been tweaked somewhat since then, but the core of the law remains the same. It doesn't require the mining industry to pay any royalties on any metals that it takes out of the ground. That's a perk that the oil and gas industry would kill for. It also was designed to develop the U.S. West, and much of California and much of the U.S. West is well populated now. And so the law was just written for a very different time. It did not imagine this electrification trend. And so the rules of the road aren't up to date for the 21st century economy. And so time and time again, I heard as I was reporting out the book, a wish list, not just from the mining industry, but also from conservationists and environmentalists for a law that brings U.S. mining into the current moment. And it's a law that's very different from other countries across the world and how they approach their own mining. So that's just one example here of, I would say, what from a regulatory perspective, I heard time and time again as I was reporting out the war below.
Right. And, one thing, one aspect of a proposed project that you hear exploration companies tout when they're able is that the site is in a stable jurisdiction.
There was an example that I cite in the book of the Twin Metals Project in northern Minnesota, and this is an underground deposit of nickel, cobalt, and copper that is found in a type of rock known as sulfide ore. And the concern from some conservationists is that if that ore were to come in contact with water, it could form acid. And the northern part of Minnesota, of course, borders the Great Lakes, which is sort of the beating heart of the North American water way infrastructure. I should say that the company that would like to develop this project is very confident that it can do so safely and there would be no damage. But conservationists and environmentalists have opposed this project for many years, and their main argument is that northern Minnesota is no place for this kind of mining operation. But the project itself has been ping-ponged back and forth from a regulatory perspective, depending on whoever is in the White House. It received some support from President Bush, second President Bush. President Obama put it on ice. President Trump moved it forward. President Biden has now put it on ice. And so one of the key executives at the company did testify before the U.S. Senate, and I included this in part of the book, where she did say that she felt the U.S. is no longer a stable regulatory climate. And those are the words that she used, and certainly very deliberate choice of words there, very pointed. The irony, of course, and that I decided to include it because the irony was just, very pointed, was that the very same day that that executive gave her testimony to the U.S. Senate, the Biden administration, President Biden himself, invoked the Defense Production Act to increase domestic production of critical minerals, saying that the country should not rely on China and other foreign nations for these building blocks of the energy transition. So there again was an example of sort of one part of the government not necessarily thinking through what another part of the government is doing. And these are things, certainly, these are broad, sticky issues that I hope our policymakers think through, but they're not going to think them through on a full level until we as voters, we as citizens say that, hey, we want a collective dialogue really around these issues. We're not having those right now.
No, not sufficient ones, at least. One crucial part of the supply of these critical minerals that you went into quite a bit is the recycling part.
Yes.
Definitely a critical part of of the hope of reaching many of the EV targets around the world. So, did the extent of this surprise you when you were researching the book?
Well, one of the main questions that I got when I started writing the book, and I would tell people I'm writing a book about critical minerals, is people, in almost as a reflex, would say, "Hey, we can just recycle that. Why do we need more mines?" 9 times out of 10, that was the question that I got. And then when you have to when you explain sort of the circular economy and the goal to move towards one day being able to just recycle old equipment and find the metals again and reuse them, that's sort of out in the future, and you just look at the sheer demand projections, then I think people started to understand it. And then you also talk through the logistical impediments right now to boosting recycling, including transportation, which is probably not what people would include on their top three impediments, expected impediments for recycling. But when you've got a bunch of old batteries sitting in a giant bin, obviously they've got some charge in them, and when you've got hundreds of them sitting there, the potential for one to explode, given that they're old batteries, is quite high. And so you can just imagine these are sort of mini bombs waiting to go off. And so transporting these batteries over large distances is a huge logistical problem for the recycling industry to have to contend with now. And I gave some examples in the book of how that actually is posing a challenge right now, and how various companies, including two that I profile, Li-Cycle and Redwood Materials, are working to try to get around that or have their own creative approaches to that. And so recycling is not a silver bullet. And so it also behooves us to have this dialogue around what are the standards that we would allow for mining, and what does it look like to have a modern mining industry, and not just the United States, but throughout the world.
Right. And a point that you made early on in our conversation was the complexity of the processing part of mining.
I think for me, especially in the writing of it, not maybe necessarily the reporting, but the writing was just sort of helping to explain to the reader how there's so many more moving parts in the mining ecosphere than there are in even oil and natural gas. I think the average person perhaps has a broad general understanding of how gasoline, for instance, is made. You take crude oil out of the ground, it goes into a refinery, and depending on how the refinery is tooled, then you might either get jet fuel or gasoline or kerosene, et cetera, et cetera. But with mining, of course, so complex, as you were saying, Maureen. I mean, there's multiple ways to produce lithium, for instance, depending on the geological formation that you're coming from, whether that's brine or spodumene hard rock, or in China, lepidolite, and that's just lithium. And then, of course, you have to process lithium into a form that's usable. You don't just put a rock into a battery. And so you would either have lithium hydroxide or lithium carbonate, depending on what type of battery you want to make and what's the end use, and sort of different technical specifications, depending again on the end use there. And so that's just lithium, and there are in different parts of the world, like for instance, Chile, the northern part of Chile, the Atacama Desert, where Albemarle and SQM have very large facilities. The lithium is taken out of the ground there, shipped across the Pacific Ocean to a processing facility in China, processed into either hydroxide or carbonate, and then shipped to a cathode facility and put into a battery pack, and then probably shipped back across the Pacific Ocean, or it's then put into, say, an electric car. So that's two journeys across the Pacific Ocean, and you can see the complexities. And so one of the things that I explore in the book as well is this idea of long supply chains, which, as we were saying, sort of came to the fore during the pandemic. And are we seeing a regionalization, and are we moving into a regionalization trend? And so that in the future, whether that's that supply could not be stopped, whether it's by weather or armed conflict or whatnot. And so should regions around the world be boosting not only their extraction, but their processing of these facilities to reduce some of that logistical complexity? I think you're starting to see companies, especially manufacturers, want to see that happen, and reduce their carbon footprint, certainly from transportation of these critical minerals, especially if the main argument for many of these new carbon abating devices like electric vehicles is you're helping the planet.
Exactly. And so not only is it helpful in reducing one's carbon footprint to not take multiple trips across the ocean, but it's
Yes.
also very costly, right? And,
Yes.
there's all, of course, we're all seeing these wonderful incentives, subsidies for more and more people to acquire EVs. But at some point, just the expense of making them with that extremely expensive supply chain, it's going to make it harder to sustain, I think, those subsidies. And
Well, I mean, I think you're referring especially to the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act,
right,
which does have a lot of carrots baked into it for not only domestic production of critical minerals, but production in countries with U.S. free trade deals or ally countries. Chile and Australia do have U.S. free trade deals, and therefore their metals are IRA compliant. But I think the more that the average consumer understands these long supply chains and the carbon footprint, the more that she or he is probably going to ask for less of a carbon footprint, especially if the EV that you're buying is supposed to help the planet. And so I'm curious to see what the long term effects are going to be and how that will affect certain projects. We have seen certain financial incentives by the U.S. Department of Energy for proposed lithium projects in the United States, and others are still applying for some of that funding. So we'll see how that goes. We also know that right now, for instance, there are relatively lower lithium prices than there were even 2 years ago due to a host of economic factors, but the demand projections are still going quite high. Copper, for instance, is really high right now because of a supply-demand imbalance. And so as the demand rises, supply is not meeting the moment. And so given that copper prices have been on the march upward this year. So those are just two of the critical minerals that were out there. I mean, nickel is a huge, important critical mineral for the energy transition, and the U.S.'s only nickel mine will be depleted in a year or two. We've got Indonesia, meanwhile, the world's largest nickel producer, that's limiting exports in order to encourage more of a supply chain, domestic production, the expansion of its supply chain for the EV chain in its own borders. And so there's just a lot of complexity here, and I'm curious to see where it goes moving forward and how the IRA affects that.
no, as I am, and I wonder, if we could imagine a world right now where we didn't have the IRA or any subsidies. I mean, here in Colorado, we also have state level incentives for
Right.
buying EVs, and many states do. say those eventually wear off or just become not sustainable due to the true cost of manufacturing. I've heard some forecasters say that we've seen such a rapid growth in the adoption of EVs that growth rate is not sustainable just because the wealthy already have their EVs. And for the rest of the population to really, in significant numbers, adopt them, that unless we can come up with a much greater supply of the critical battery metals, they won't be affordable.
Well, I mean, there's no way around the fact that certainly, the cost of a critical mineral does obviously affect the cost of the end product. I mean, it's sort of obviously true for any commodity. But Maureen, one of the things I became curious about when I was writing the book is, okay, this has got to be about so much more than just transportation, right? I mean, we're not just talking about everyone owning an electric car. We're talking about all the new electronic gadgets and gizmos that we have in our homes that perhaps we didn't even have 20 or 30 years ago. The cameras that we're talking to each other through right now, our laptops, our cell phones, sort of many other devices. And I have a chapter in the book that talks about leaf blowers. And this might sound whimsy, but I included it on purpose because I wanted the reader to think through this reality that we're not just talking about electric vehicles, that even if nobody got an electric vehicle, or even if the market is completely saturated because only a certain segment of the population is going to actually buy them, there's still thousands of other devices out there that we use now that are powered by lithium-ion batteries that weren't even 20 or 30 years ago. So leaf blowers have historically been powered by two-stroke engines, and they're anathema to many host governments across the world because of that. Now, two-stroke engines just like spew out this noxious, nasty mix of hydrocarbons and smog that contributes to global warming. And so governments in California and Washington, D.C. and other parts of the world are beginning to phase them out. They're extremely unpopular with certain people. But as I was writing this book, I got a house and I decided to go all in on electric because, hey, I got to be on brand here. So I got an electric lawnmower and, yes, an electric leaf blower because two-stroke engine leaf blowers are apparently horrible for the environment. But that brought me down this rabbit hole of, okay, well, where did all the critical minerals used to build that leaf blower come from? Did the lithium come from Chile? Did the copper come from Peru? Did the cobalt come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where sometimes, sadly, children as young as 6 or 7 can actually be part of the supply chain? And there's really no way to trace that. And Maureen, I got to tell you, I've got a lot of resources at my disposal in my day job and elsewhere, and I couldn't figure out where those critical minerals came from. And that's just for my one lowly leaf blower. And now sort of extrapolate that across all the other devices that are powered by lithium-ion batteries now that weren't even 10, 20, 30 years ago. And you begin to see the supply chain transparency problem right there. And also, if you don't know what you don't know, then you don't know if you're contributing to lower ESG standards in part of the world or in horrible social standards. So I really think that this was a great example to include in the book because it really helped the reader understand that this is about so much more than just transportation or EVs more directly. This is about all of the other electronic devices we use every single day that are powered by critical minerals that come out of the ground. So where those critical minerals come from matter.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And frankly, even if nobody cared about climate change, we still have to do mining day and night
Yes.
because
Yeah.
copper,
Yeah.
and obviously we do
Yes.
care about climate change. But, and to your point, it's not just about EVs at all. Many of the technologies for decarbonization are dependent on big overlap with battery metals, right? So I
Yes.
say EVs all the time because I think that's what resonates most with people, although we're all surrounded with our devices and will be more in the future that,
Indeed.
are totally dependent on these. So I think a theme that really resonated with me, and I'm sure many readers in the book, is the growing dominance of China in the mining industry, not just mining, but the whole supply chain from, processing, distribution, and commercializing that, striking agreements with various manufacturers. This has been going on for a while. And although, many of us are sort of pretty concerned about that, it doesn't seem to be slowing. And I think in many areas it's increasing, especially in Africa. Do you get a lot of questions about that?
Well, I think there's And I do track this and chronicle this in the book. There's no question that China has saw the importance of the critical mineral supply chain earlier than others. In the 1980s, 1990s, Beijing began to really invest heavily, not only in mining projects, but also in the technical know-how in universities and education programs around mining and mining engineering. And so today, most of the mining engineering programs in the world are in mainland China, and the U.S. only has about 12 or 13. One, of course, in Colorado School of Mines, great school, but only one of a handful in the domestic United States. Mining engineering is just not considered a sexy industry anymore by university students to actually study. But China realized years ago that this was a huge potential growth engine. And I do argue in the book that its control over much of the critical mineral sector has helped power its economy to the second largest in the world. One example that I cite in the book is rare earths. Now, rare earths, the name is a bit of a misnomer. They're not all that rare. What's rare is to find them in large quantities, but this is a grouping of about 17 minor metals, and they're used to make magnets that help turn power into motion. So in an electric vehicle, you take power from the battery, and this magnet will help turn the wheels. The thing that helps your phone vibrate when you have it on vibrate mode is a rare earth magnet. And the United States helped really to pioneer the modern rare earths industry in the years after World War II, thanks to the Mountain Pass mine in California, which is just outside Las Vegas. And the mine, though, right now is owned by a company that's been trying to resurrect it and its on-site processing after the previous owner went bankrupt. And the previous owner went bankrupt due to many issues, but one of the main ones was stiff competition from Chinese rivals that flooded the market with low-priced rare earths. And they were able to do this for a host of reasons, not the least of which is that China has used its control of critical minerals, especially rare earths, as economic weapons, as tools to use to affect other producers across the world, and also to attract manufacturing to its own borders. So it gives manufacturers that locate to mainland China a reduced rate for access to these rare earths, which is a huge carrot that obviously benefits the country's economy. And so during the course of this chapter, you get to learn about the history of this mine in California, how it went through a series of owners, and kind of the reality where it is today, where it's locked in this battle with its Chinese rivals and is trying to resume full production in California to help the U.S. economy sort of get back on its feet in the rare earth space. And it's an extremely complex journey, and you get to meet the people on all sides of this in this chapter and to see what sort of makes them tick. And sort of explore the complexities around that. But that's just one example of how China has really seen the long-term advantage of focusing on this space.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Well, thank you, Ernest, for joining us on the show today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'll stay tuned with interest to your next reporting on the topic.
Great to be with you, Maureen. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for joining us today. To make sure you don't miss out on our next episode, subscribe to the Inside ESG podcast on Spotify or any podcast platform, the YouTube channel, the LinkedIn newsletter, and our mailing list on InsideESG.com. See you next time.